In 1725, Rabbi Zalman Hena published Shaarei Tefilah and sparked a controversy by calling for a full stop to the use of taam ha'elyon, the unique system of Trop traditionally used for reading the Aseres Hadibros. Rabbi Yaakov Emden wasn't having it and fired back forcefully in his Luach Eresh. This class unpacks their debate, the sources they cite, the Alter Rebbe's position, and what we know about the two competing systems of Trop for reliving Matan Torah.
The Yavitz published a sefer called Luach Eresh. This sefer he printed in 1769, and the entirety of this sefer is an attack on another rabbi whose name was Rabbi Zalman Hena. Rabbi Zalman Hena, a few decades earlier, had published a sefer called Shaarei Tefilah. And we're going to be spending some time today talking about this Rabbi Zalman Hena and his work Shaarei Tefilah, published in 1725. The Yavitz's work Luach Eresh, he's very unhappy with some of the things Rabbi Zalman Hena wrote. And we're going to read one passage from the Hakdama to begin tonight's shir. He writes, the fact that Rabbi Zalman Hena has great haskamas. He has, in his printed sefer Shaarei Tefilah, he has a haskama from my own father. The Yavitz's father was Reb Tzvi Ashkenazi, otherwise known as the Chacham Tzvi, and he has a haskama from him. He also has a haskama from the Rav of Beis Din of Frankfurt am Main, whose name was Rabbi Avram Broda. So it's going to obviously be hard to attack a sefer if your own father gave a haskama to that sefer and Rabbi Avram Broda gave a haskama to that sefer. And for that matter, there were other prominent rabbis who gave a haskama to the sefer. So the Yavitz says something quite shocking. The accusation is a startling accusation. Halo yadanu mahayoloi, we know what happened. Shechokak chikekei oven shav v'sheker muchlat. He essentially published false haskamas, loy hoya v'loy nivra, and they never happened. V'anochi hayadei v'eid, and I can testify she'en divrei ksavim sheksavam, that these are lies that he wrote. This is a very, very serious accusation, and we're left today trying to figure out what to make of it, because it's, on the one hand, it's a very serious accusation. And therefore, to say that Reb Zalman Hena did that is kind of like difficult. On the other hand, it's the Yavitz saying that he has some inside information about his father. So till today, people are arguing about this. But I just wanted to use this to set the stage to make a very simple point. And that point is, the Yavitz is very unhappy with Reb Zalman Hena, going so far as to accuse him of forging a haskama. So let's try to dig in and understand why he's so upset about Reb Zalman Hena. Reb Zalman Hena's dates are 1687 to 1746. Hena is a town outside Frankfurt am Main, about 25 kilometers away from Frankfurt. He later moved around in different places in Europe. When he published the Sefer Shaarei Tefilah in 1725, he was living in Hamburg. All the way at the end of the Sefer, Siman Shin Chav Hei, it looks like there's a standalone kuntris over there that's written almost like a responsa, like a responsum, like a tshuva. Look what he writes. Nidrashti la'asher sha'aluni, so I'm addressing this that I was asked, al inyan akriya ha'nechoina ba'aseres hadibros, about the proper way of reading the Aseres Hadibros. Ha'im yeish b'koyach ha'seichel ha'anushi, is there a human way possible, lahamti derech nigla, to come up with an easy to understand, open, non-esoteric explanation, b'masha hunchu shnei minei ta'amim ba'aseres hadibros, why there are two types of trops in Aseres Hadibros. This is the question that I was asked, v'zoisi atshuva asher shafti, and here is the answer. And again, all of Siman Shin Chav Hei is an answer to this question. So what is he dealing here with? He's dealing here with the fact that Ad Hayoim, if you open your Chumash, the Aseres Hadibros, you have where it says one style of trop in the body of the Chumash itself. So in the Chumash I'm looking at over here, for example, Lo yeh lecha Elokim acherim al panai, stop, that's the end of a pasuk. And the trop goes like this, Lo yeh lecha Elokim acherim al panai. Now you never heard that in your life. You never heard that pasuk being sung in that life, as far as I know. And that's because we're used to the taam ha'elyon, where this whole lo yelecha is in much more complicated and fancier trop. So, two systems of trop for the Aseres Hadibros. The person asks Rabbi Zalman Hena, what is the reason for these two systems? And he says that he's going to give an answer to this question. In order to give an answer to this question, he first cites earlier sources that address this issue. First up is Rabbi Menachem de Lanzano. Rabbi Menachem de Lanzano lived in the late 1500s, early 1600s. The Chidan Shem Agdoilim writes about him that he's a avir b'Torah, a mighty one in Torah. V'hifli lasos b'sefer Or Torah, and he did amazing things in his work titled Or Torah, and he was a medakdek atzum, and he was a significant authority when it comes to diktuk, and specifically the exact mesorah of nekudos in the Torah, in Tanakh, and the Trop, etc. He bounced around a little. He lived a little in Eretz Yisrael. He lived in Constantinople. He may have lived in Italy as well. And he writes, when it comes to the Aseres Hadibros and Parshas Yisro, Rabbi Menachem writes as follows: Pamachas, one time, Hayisi besoid Yisharim Chachamim Unevoinim Mikehila Kedosha Grikos. I was together with a whole bunch of smart people, with a whole bunch of rabbis from the Jewish community of Grekos. I'm not entirely sure. It sounds like Greek, but I don't know exactly what that is or where it is. But anyway, Vishal HaShoyel, and the question was asked, Lama lo yi'elecha lekim acherim al panai? How come when it comes to the pasuk lo yi'elecha lekim acherim al panai, yud panai nekuda bepatach? The yud under panai has a patach. Now, if you open your chumash, you're not going to understand what this is talking about, because lo yi'elecha lekim acherim al panai, there's no nikud under the yud. But obviously, in the 1500s or the 1600s, they're looking at a different situation, and where under the yud there is a patach. So if you look at this other sheet over here, the image on the top left. So the image on the top left is one of these classic prints of the Chumash of Venice, 1524. This was a very seminal publication of Chumash, together with some classic mefarshim, published by a man named Yaakov ben Chaim. And if you look at the top line where it says you'll see that under the yud there is indeed a patach. So this is this conversation that's going on where they're asking, why is it that we have a patach under the yud?
How would you pronounce it?
Good question. How would you pronounce it? We'll discuss it in a second. Visham amru kama tshuvas. So at this meeting, there's a whole bunch of rabbis here. So everyone gave a different answer. The best answer, he says, was that this is a machloikes between Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali, whether the nun deserves a kamatz or whether the nun deserves a patach. Remember, by us, it has, in the standard chumash, the nun is printed with a kamatz. I'm talking in the standard print. So he's saying over here that around this table, they said, it's a machlekes between Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali, whether it needs to be a kamatz or a patach. So they did both. They put a kamatz and a patach, just the patach got pushed off. Really, it's under the same nun, a machlekes between a kamatz and a patach. What is this Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali? So the most familiar way we're familiar with Ben Asher is from the Rambam in Hilchis Stam, in Paraches. He talks about the fact that there's some confusion with the stumas and psuchis in Torah, and he wants to really get it right, and so he's documenting all the stumas and psuchis in the Torah. Where is he getting it from? Where is he getting his source? So he tells you he's getting it from a sefer that was muga through a man named Ben Asher. So Ben Asher is someone who lived in Eretz Yisrael. They assume he lived in Tveria, and he was a big expert when it came to these types of questions: a psucha, a stuma, a kamatz, a patach, this trop versus that trop, all these types of issues. And the Rambam felt that he was very reliable and relied on him very much for the list of psuchas and stumas that he delivered there. Well, it turns out that in addition to Ben Asher, there were other people who were authorities. And we know one of them, his name was Ben Naphtali. And they lived at the same time in the same place. In fact, there are manuscripts of Chumashim that right in the beginning, there'll be a fancy list of Ben Asher, Ben Naphtali, of the variations that will be between them. He will have a pashta here, he'll have a different trop, or things like that. So this is the Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali. So people were aware of this because many of the Chumash manuscripts, and even in the early generation of printed Chumashim, you would have this from time to time where it would open with a list of all of the differences between Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali. So maybe that's what's going on over here. Maybe this falls into the category of a machlokes between Ben Asher and Ben Naftali. Says Rabbi Nachem, V'zu nevuah sheker. This is baloney. Ki pluktes Ben Asher or Ben Naftali le b'shamayim him. It's not an esoteric question of what they debated. Itanu hein gam betvus gam ksivas yad. We're able to see in our printed chumashim as well as in our manuscripts the issues that are debated by these two. V'loy pligi b'zen. No one has this on their list of how you're supposed to have the nikud for the word pana. When I saw that they were listening to garbage answers on Isi, so I decided to intervene. And I asked, Valama panai b'ravia. How come you have the trop? Lo yelacha elikim acherim al panai. Why do you have it with a ravia, with what we sometimes call a revi'i, different ways of calling the same trop? Kivan shehi soif pasuk. Given that it is a soif pasuk, why is it that we have it a review? Why do you have two conflicting trops on one particular word? So in these looking now, depending on the problem is the trop in these chomashim isn't so clear, so lav dafka you're able to actually see the fact that there's two trop, but definitely there are cases where you're able to see it in a very clear way that there's a soif pasuk and there's also a revia over there. And so after he asked the second question, he says, now I'll tell you the answer. There are two different ways of reading the Aseres Hadibros. Hakriya ha'achas, the first one is liyachid hakor. That's for an individual who's learning on his own, or who's doing shnai mikra ve'echad targum on his own. V'hakriya acheres, and the other one is l'koyde b'tzibur, is when you're reading in tzibur, whether it's Shavuos, whether it's Shabbos V'eschana, whether it's Shabbos Yisroi. If you're being koyde b'tzibur, you have to read this other system. Ulekach, and that explains what's going on over here. Beroiv hapsukim shebeyuda dibris yeshnei taam, and that's why most psukim end up having two systems of trop. Kamoi milas panai, like the milas panai, yesh ba revia v'soif pasuk. You have a revi and you have a soif pasuk. The yachid koira b'soif pasuk. When you're an individual, so you're reading it, what we call today tama tachtoin. So then you lo yelecha lekim acherim al panai. Finished. That's the whole thing. But the person who reads it b'tzibur, koida b'revia, he reads it as a revi, and that's why you have the second trop there. Now, a difference in trop affects the nikud as well. And he goes on to explain. That's why the nun needed both a kamatz and a patach. The kamatz l'koida b'soif pasuk. If the word panoi is the end of a pasuk, then that's what it needs to sound like, panoi, with a kamatz under the nun. However, if panoi is not the end of the pasuk, it's the middle of the pasuk, panai is the middle of the pasuk, so then it needs to be panai, because that's the way the rules of, we're not going to spend too much time on this, but the nikud very much is impacted by the trop, or are you at the end of the pasuk or not. And so therefore, you needed to have, and that's why you have both of these nikudas under the nun. Don't think that there was a yud, that the yud has the patach. No. Don't think the yud doesn't have a patach. It doesn't belong there. It's nothing to do. It's nothing to do with the yud. Then he goes on to say, "Va'matvis," the printer, and what he means the printer, he means this Yaakov ben Chaim, the printer of the Venice 1524 Chumash, Kasal al milas panai, wrote by the word panai that has these double trop, the kamatz and the patach. He wrote, "Kain dinoi leman diyalif raza." This is how it should be to the person who knows the secrets. In other words, this Yaakov ben Chaim, and you can actually see it in the image right here, to the right of Lo Yelecha Lekim Acherim Al Panai, you could see those words to the right of there in the margin in Rashi script. Kain dinoi leman diyalif raza. In other words, the printer looks and he's like, why am I having panoi with a trop, with a patach under the yud? This doesn't really make any sense. Well, maybe there's some deep reason for this, and maybe we heard some deep reason, or maybe he asked and found out some deep reason, and so he puts that in over there. Says Rabbi Nachem v'divrei ruachein. This is not true. It's not at all true. There isn't any deep secrets over here. It's very, very practical, and it's very, very simple. You have two systems of trop that lead to two systems of nikud, and what we're seeing over here, this is becoming clear, today they're separate. You learn it at Chumash, in the body of the Chumash there's one, and then either on the bottom of the page or usually in the back of the Sefer, you'll have the other system. In those days, they were put together on the exact same words, they had both layers of Trop and both layers of Nikud over there, leading to this confusion. What's really amazing when you stop over here is that you realize that Rabbi Menachem is saying that he's talking to very intelligent people. He's talking to he calls them Chachamim, Nevoinim. These are intelligent people. And the person who printed this was also, he knew what he's talking about, who wrote Kain Dinoi Laman de Yalif Raza. He's a Talmud Chacham. He knew his stuff. And nonetheless, you're able to see over here that in the 1500s, 1600s, there's a lot of confusion about this issue. People don't even understand why this is happening, what are these dual systems, that there are two systems, and when they're supposed to be used is kind of something that is confusing. And it's like his chiddush. He comes and he reveals to the people that you should know that there are two systems, and this is Rabbi Menachem de Lonzano's point. Now, as I said, Rabbi Zalman Hena brings this. He's not going to like what he said, but he brings this. He also brings another source. The other source Rabbi Zalman Hena brings is Rabbi Yaakov Ibn Chabib. Rabbi Yaakov Ibn Chabib goes back a little earlier. If you remember a few weeks ago, we did Levi Ibn Chabib from the Chiddush HaSmichas. This is his father. And his father is famous for putting together, compiling the Ein Yaakov, which is two jobs. One job is selecting the actual passages of the Gemara that's going to go in. The second job is he wrote a commentary. He wrote a commentary called HaKoisiv. And here we have a piece on Mesech Shkolim, where Rabbi Yaakov Ibn Chabib writes as follows. If I didn't say his dates, 1450 roughly to 1516. Shaarei Hadibros nanaktim bebeis nekudos ubeis taamim. Most of the Aseres Hadibros have two nekudos and two taamim. I might as well point out now, why is it most and not all? The reason it's most and not all is because if you have a dibra that is the exact same, kabedis avicha v'esimecha, there isn't two systems. There's only one system for how to read kabedis avicha v'esimecha, and so therefore that's why this rule doesn't apply to that dibra. Let's continue. V'yesh Kigoin, for example, nun panai nenakta bekamat ubepatach. The nun has both a kamat and a patach. So he's echoing the same thing that Rabbi Menachem said. In fact, Rabbi Menachem, by the way, quotes also Rabbi Yaakov Ibn Chabib. V'yesh bepasuk beis taamim. There's also two systems of Trop, and he calls them a name now. Rabbi Menachem actually didn't give us a name for them. He gives us a name. They're called Gvoyim u'Shvelim. High ones and low ones. He doesn't explain why they're called this way. We'll talk more about it later on. But these are the two different systems of Trop. So too, when you come to Loiser Tzach Loisinov, Hanakudis v'ataimin kefulim, there's double Nikud and double Trop. There's another chiddush over there. Shakol taf mehem, every taf, yesh mehem dagesh v'rafa. Is dagesh and rafa. Dagesh means with a pintala, rafa means without a pintala. So do me a favor, look back to the page with the images. On the right-hand side, the top right, look at Lo Tirtzach, Lo Tinof, and Lo Signoi. You'll see it's all menukad with a taf. So it's Lo Tirtzach, Lo Tinof, Lo Tignoi. So that works when you read it, what we call Tama Elyon, where you read Loi, and there's a break, Tirtzach. So because without getting into the rules of the diktuk, when there's a break after the aleph, so then there's going to end up being Tirtzach with a dagesh. And likewise Lo Tinof. However, look on top of the tafs. You see there's a line over there? What's that line doing over there? So that line is actually used to be an important system in Nikud that for whatever reason disappeared from Jewish history, at least in most places. And that is, today, how do you make a beis? With a pintala. How do you make a vase? Nothing, you just do nothing. How do you make a taf? With a pintala. How do you make a saf? Again, nothing. Likewise, anytime there's dagesh on the opposite of dagesh, even in letters that we're not familiar with the exact pronunciation of it, there's dagesh, letters that have a dagesh, letters without. How do you indicate a letter doesn't have a dagesh? Simple. You just don't put it there. That's the system we're all used to today. But as you can see over here, there used to be a different system. A dagesh was, a rafa was not just something that you didn't do something. You actually actively indicated that it was a rafa. How? You put a horizontal line on top of the vase, a horizontal line on top of the taf, on the top of the saf, and likewise any letter that was a non-dagesh, was a rafa, you would put that line. Which really now makes this image that I'm showing you now on the right-hand side, Venice 1525, makes it really, really shocking. Because on the one hand it says Tirtzach, but on the other hand there's a makaf, there's that horizontal line on top of the taf. So is it a taf or is it a saf? Likewise, if you go to the Leningrad Codex, this is one of the oldest kisvei yad of the Tanakh, and you look at loy tirtzach and loy sinaf, you'll see the same thing. On the one hand, there is a dagesh in the tuf. On the other hand, there's a horizontal line on top of the tuf, so it's a tuf and a saf. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden is talking about the fact that we have this, and he says again, the reason this is happening is because it's two systems. In one system, it's a tuf, and in the other system, it is a saf. He goes on to say, the reason why we have these differences is well known, Rabbi Yaakov says. There's two ways of reading it. Ha'alef, the first one, when you're learning on your own. So when you're learning on your own, you don't need to read each of the Aseres Hadibros to become one. But when a person reads b'tzibur, each one of the Aseres Hadibros needs to be a thing on its own. Whether it is a long one, or whether it is a short one. Okay, so here he's finally giving us a little words to explain what's going on over here. If you want to divide the Aseres Hadibros by 10, so then you need a different system from the standard system that we call the taam hatachton in our Chumash. Because in our Chumash, take for example, the lo yelachal akim achinam al panai. So that's one. Here it appears in 4 psukim. But if you want to read it as one dibra, the way it came, the way the Yidden heard it at Har Sinai, you wouldn't want to break. So you would want it kind of as one flow. So that's why we have this other system. Now Rabbi Yaakov, and go to the other ones. So in the Tama Tachtoin, Loisirtzach, Loisinav, Loisignav, Loisanav, Reachai, Chakar, all that's one pasuk. But hold on a second, that's 4 separate dibras. So the other system helps you break it up. Loi tirtzach, loi tinaf, as opposed to loi tirtzach, loi tinaf, loi signav, loi sanav rechai chakar, which would be getting it all into one pasuk. Now, when Rabbi Yaakov talks about it here, it's interesting. He sounds like what he's saying is, when it really matters, you have to do it the way the Jews heard it at Sinai. When you're reading it b'yachid, so then we're not going to bother you. Ain't a medaktek. Likra is called dibur. Then we're not going to bother you to do it in this way. Now it really matters. So tzarich, now you need to do it. So it sounds like, though he's not 100% clear, that it's like, who likes doing long psukim that you have to hold your breath for a long time? On the other hand, and who likes, it doesn't sound nice, short, brief psukim. People like what they're used to. People are used to average size psukim. So it almost sounds like that's what he's saying. When you're doing it b'yachid, so we give you nice bite-sized psukim, not too long, not too short, and whatever, that's how you'll do it. But when it really matters, then you need to do it the way it sounded at Har Sinai. That's the pashtus, what he seems to be saying. And then it goes on to say, and that's why there's going to be a difference with the Trop, and the Nekudos, and the Dagesh, and the Rafa. And he concludes his piece saying, it's important to be very, very careful, sheyizoyer. When you're reading, be careful not to read both nekudos when you're reading it. Some people stretch out the yud in panai as if that a patach. So, in terms of the question of if you read it there with the kamas and the patach, it would probably, people could read panoi, something like that, which is ridiculous. And he's like, no, be careful not to do it. Now, he's writing that because people were doing it. And people were doing it, makes sense, because we saw that it's around the same tkufa. Rabbi Nachman de Lozano is in the late 1500s, early 1600s. He's in the late 1400s, early 1500s. And we saw earlier Rabbi Nachman saying that people are confused about it. So it makes sense that he needs to say, as much as he said that it's meforsim, everyone knows this, I don't think he means literally everyone knows this. A lot of people know it, a lot of people don't know it, and so therefore he's telling you need to be careful. Recognize we have 2 different systems over here. Then he goes on to say, now let's go back now to Rabbi Nachman, because Rabbi Nachman cited this passage of Rabbi Yaakov, and remember, people are getting confused. So Rabbi Nachman says, because I see many people don't know how to divide these systems, don't know what's for the yachid and what's for the tzibur. And they're groping the way a person who doesn't have vision is groping in darkness. So therefore, I came up with this genius idea. Let's produce it twice. Elu lumas elu, this next to that. And that's what he did. In his Sefer Torah, as far as I know, he's the first one to actually do it. He gives you the Aseres Hadibros, once in what we call taam ha'elyon, once in what we call taam ha'tachton. Be'elu asim ha'tamim shehunchu l'koyre b'yachid. Here I'll give you the taimim that you use b'yachid, uve'elu asim ha'tamim shehunchu l'koyre b'tzibur. And here I'll give you, and the other one I'll give you the taimim that is used for the tzibur. This is the first two sources that Rabbi Zalman Hena produces on this matter. The tzad hashava between both of them is that it's a question of yachid and tzibur. Yachid, you're always doing what we call taam ha'tachton. If you're b'tzibur, you're always doing taam ha'elyon. They don't really explain a lot why. There's not much explanation why. It's more of the what. What needs to happen? This is what they have to say. Rabbi Zalman Hena turns now and brings a source that is more from Ashkenaz. In other words, these two individuals are more associated with Svardim. And he brings now from Rabbi Binyamin Selnik. Rabbi Binyamin Selnik is from the 1500s. He was a Talmud of the Ramah. And his Sha'al Sechuvas is Mas As Binyamin. And Mas As Binyamin Simin Vav begins with an individual posing a question to him, saying, I'm all confused about the Aseres Hadibros, and he asks like 7 different questions. And so Rabbi Binyamin Selnik cleans up the situation for him and just clarifies the whole thing. And he writes, just bekitzer, Shnei Pnei Taimim Hein L'Shtei Kavanis. There are 2 systems of taimim, and they're for 2 different reasons. Hatama echad ushakoyrenoi tama tachtoin. What we call the tama tachtoin, or another name, neginois haktanois, they're smaller notes. Hatam hash, and that's one system. And he goes and explains the whole system. Hatam hasheni, in the second system, heim haneginos hagdoilos. These are the bigger musical notes. V'nikra tama elyon, and these are called tama elyon. So we have already a few names, because Rabbi Yaakov Emden told us gvoyim and shvelim, and here we got tachtoin and elyon, neginos gdoilos and neginos ktanos. We have a few names. I think we'll have more in a minute. So he says these are 2 systems, and then he goes on to explain what we said before, how this affects taimim, it affects the Trop, it affects the nekudas, and good. Now, at the end of a long essay, he says, I went on, and I didn't have to go on for so long. Why? Because I have a kanos over here. I'm bothered. I'm very bothered by something going on in our community. He was a Rav in Podheiz. Podheiz is in Galicia. Sheruba deruba me chazanim, most chazanim, which included the people who were laning, einam yoidim b'kriyas hatayra ben yamin v'smel. They have no clue how to lane. Uparshas Aseres Hadibros, when it comes to the Aseres Hadibros, koydim b'seider Yisroi u'b'seider v'eschanon, they read on the Parshas Yisroi and Parshas v'eschanon b'shabbat shalahem kemoy shekoydim b'yem Matan Torah. They read it like it's Shavuos, and that's a problem. So in other words, we already see he actually has a different approach from the 2 earlier sources. The 2 earlier sources said, that's great. On all 3 times that you do Kriya B'tzibur, you should be reading a certain taam. He's saying over here, no, that's not, that's wrong. They're reading Yisra and Eschanon the way you're supposed to do it on Shavuos. In other words, Shavuos, you're supposed to do what we call taam ha'elyon. The other times of the year, you're not supposed to be doing the taam ha'elyon. Okay, then he goes on and says, but you know something? If that's really what they did, and that is they read the Trop the way you're supposed to do it on Shavuos, and they did that on Yisra and Veschanan, it wouldn't be such a big deal. It wouldn't be so problem. If they taka used one system, if they just use a taam ha'tachton shehi iker, which is the main thing. Because again, he holds that that's what you need to do Parshas Yisro, you need to do taam tachton. That's what you need to do Parshas Eschanon, you need to do taam tachton. And here he says the words, that's the main one, which explains why it's the default. Shavuos is a chiddush where you don't do it. So if they just did taam tachton levadoi, that would be great. Even if they just did taam elyon levadoi, still, so then that would also be okay. Even though it's not ideal. He prefers that they would do taam tachton on those 2 Shabbosos, but okay, fine. The problem is, Hema Arvin Kol HaPsukim. They mix the whole system up. Because what he means, let me say that again. Hema Arvin Kol HaPsukim, they bind together all the psukim, which means they turn Lo Yeh Lecha Elikim Achedim, they turn that all into one pasuk, but when it comes to Leisertzach and Leisinov, they also turn that into one pasuk. So in other words, they're not doing either system, because they're not dividing it by the psukim and the taam hatachton. They're not dividing it by the taam ha'elyon, because taam ha'elyon is divided by the 10 dibros. They're not doing that, because they're doing Leisertzach, Leisinov, Leisigna, Leisanav, Chakar. They're doing that all together. And so that is, that doesn't work. And then he really expands the discussion, and he says it's part of a broader conversation about the fact that the Baalei Kriya are Bechlal, they're not Medayik when it comes to the Nekudis, and they're not Medayik when it comes to the Taimim. They don't know the Diktuk. And he says the reason is because the Kehillah chooses people only for their musical talents, and they want to hear new songs, and every Shabbos and every month they bring a new song, and I don't even know where these songs are coming from. Some of these songs, I think, he writes Meyaldei Hanachrim, I don't know exactly, comes from the non-Jewish children, and the other songs he thinks they come from the theaters. It's terrible, how do they bring these things in? No one cares, because they don't care about Diktuk, they just care about the music. And so he goes on to really expand the conversation way beyond the Aseres Hadibros into a broader societal problem that he was witnessing at the time. But the bottom line is, we see from here, there was confusion, which is why, just like in the other sources, someone turned to the rabbi with 7 different questions about why is there different Nekudis, why is there different time, and what's going on over here. He sets the record straight, but a little bit in a different way. And the different way is a different minute. Everyone agrees, Shavuos needs to be read, what we call the taam ha'elyon. However, he holds that when it comes to the other 2 Shabbos, with times we read the Aseres Hadibros, Parshas Yisro and Parshas Vayischanan, he believes those need to be done b'taam ha'tachton. Okay, all of these sources, Rabbi Zalman Hena brings in Shaarei Tefilah Siman Shin Chav Hey, which I told you was which is an answer to a question that he was asked about how we're supposed to read the Aseres Hadibros. Well, guess what? Rabbi Zalman strongly disagrees with everything that he saw. Now, what is there to disagree with? What there is to disagree with is that all of these sources are okay reading sometimes this way and sometimes that way, and there's obviously some legitimacy in both, which is why there's a valid path for both. And Rabbi Zalman thinks that that's wrong. Rabbi Zalman thinks there's only one right way, and the other way is completely wrong and is an error. So he's going to go explain why he thinks that. And I want to remind you, the Yavitz is really upset at Rabbi Zalman for the work at large, and also including for this piece, as we're going to see. So what was Rabbi Zalman's problem with this? So the first thing is, he quotes a Gemara, Megillah Daf Chav Beis Amud Aleph. The Gemara there says the following: Kol psuka d'lo paskei Moshe. Any pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't tell us where to stop, anan lo paskinole, we're not going to stop. And therefore, when it comes to Kriyas HaTorah, and the Gemara there is talking about an instance in where you need 3 psukim. But what if you don't have 3 psukim? So what are you supposed to do? So one option is you'll read another pasuk again. Another option, the Gemara raises the possibility, maybe divide a pasuk in half. So Rav says, no, we can't do that. Why? Because kol psuka d'lo paskin Moshe anan lo paskinole. Now it is true, Shmuel in the Gemara there is willing to entertain the idea of dividing a pasuk in half, but that's only if it's mamish, you have no other choice mamish. Says Rabbi Zalman, once you have that, so the pasuk was given by Moshe Rabbeinu in one specific way. If it was given in one specific way, who are you to come and introduce a different way? And so we have a major problem over here, the fact that we created an alternate system that changes the beginnings and ending of these psukim. Number one. Number two, the other issue is, remember, it changes loisinov to loitinov, etc. And there are many examples like that. So he brings from the Rambam in Hilchos Krishma Perek Beis Halacha Tes, where the Rambam talks about the fact that we need to be very careful when we recite Krishma, Shelo yirape hachazak v'lo yachzik harofa, that you shouldn't, in simple English, don't mix up your bases and vases. So that's exactly what we do. Presumably one is right, the other is wrong. So you have some agenda that you want to change it for whatever reason. Very nice. You want to change it. Maybe it's a valid reason, but ultimately if you change the base to a vase and a tuf to a saf, that goes against this rule for Hilchos Krishma. Presumably the same thing should apply for Kriyas HaTorah, and so therefore he doesn't like this. Continues Reb Zalman, and he says his theory. V'daiti b'zeh, I want to tell you what's really going on over here. Why is it that we have in these? And remember, it's an ancient tradition. You have the Kisvei Yad that go back 1,000 years from our day already have the dual system. So by the time they're writing, he's writing now in the 1700s is when he publishes his work. This has been a long established custom for a long time. So he needs to explain how it happened. So he says his opinions as follows. Shatame ha'elyoin hema b'vchinas ha'ksiva. The taam ha'elyoin is called ksiva, ksiv. We have this concept of kri and ksiv. This week in Parshas Bamidbar, you have Eile Kruei Ha'eda. In the Sefer Torah, it's written Kriei Ha'eda. So that's a classic example of Kri and Ksiv, where we read it one way, but it's written another way. So he's going to say, Tama Elyoin is Ksiv, similar to the fact that it says Kriei Ha'eda, not Kruei Ha'eda. The Tamei HaTachtoin, the way it's printed in the standard Chumash, Heima B'vchinas HaKri, that's the level of, that's the Kri. And that explains why in the Chumash you have all these stumos between these dibros, like Sirtzach, like Sinov, like Signov, have these stumos. In fact, if you look at these two images on this sheet, both in the Leningrad Codex, you see how it's set up as a psuchas and stumas over there, and likewise in the Venice 1525 edition on the right-hand side, you see the samach sprinkled across. So let's think about this. Does the stuma impact kri at all when the way we verbalize the text? No. Stuma and psucha only impacts what? The ksiv. So perfect, because the tama elyoin is where we end up having loy sirtzach, loy sinov, loy signov all divided separately. So that's a question of ksiv, just like stumas and psuchas is a question of ksiv. You see where he's going? That should never be verbalized. That should never be something that actually comes out of our mouth. Vahepech, he says, by anoichi and zachar. So here he says the ksiv is psukim aruchim, but the kri is divided into short psukim. No. The kri is divided into short. The ksiv is a long pasuk, and the ksiv is a long pasuk, and the kri is short psukim for the beginning over there. Okay, and he says, what's the evidence of this? Because it's such outlandishly long. You never in Tanakh do you have such a long pasuk. So obviously that can't be the kri how we're supposed to read it. It's just the ksiv. Ki kvar mevor, it is well known. Ki b'chol makom sheish kri v'ksiv. Whenever there's a debate between the kri and the ksiv, what prevails in terms of practice? Tamid yia ksiv shaloi kamishpat halashon. The ksiv is always, so to speak, to use a lack of a better term, appears erroneous, like kriye krue. Krue makes more sense. Kriye ho'eda makes less sense. So anytime there's a conflict between kri and ksiv, the one that makes more sense is the one that is verbalized, not the one that is written. So it's the same thing with the psukim. It makes no sense to have a pasuk 2 words. It makes no sense to have a pasuk going on for 15 lines. Those are things that don't make sense. But it's okay. A ksiv could not make sense. But the kri always has to make sense. We always should be reading Tamei HaTachton because that makes sense. Not 2-word psukim, not very, very long psukim. And this is bein b'yachid, bein b'tzibur, bein b'chag hashvuos, bein b'shar yamim. Always, always, always. This is how it's supposed to be read. Why then do you have Tama Elyon? It's there. It's there in the early prints. It's there in the early manuscripts. Yeah, it's there. It's there, something to look at. The same way you have Kriya Eda. It's something to look at. Okay, but it's more than something to look at. It's teaching you something. So he's going to tell us what it teaches us. Now, supporting evidence, he decides to bring what he calls a medrash. This is Psikta Zutrasa. Psikta Zutrasa could be confusing because very often it appears and it sounds like a medrash because there is a medrash called Psikta. However, Psikta Zutrasa, as far as we can tell, was authored by one of the Rishonim. His name was Reb Tuvia ben Eliezer. This work was authored around the year 1100. He lived in Greece. And it's a running commentary on the Chumash. And he addresses there the following question. In Parshas Va'aschanan, there's differences between the Aseres Hadibros in Va'aschanan versus Yisrael. One of the differences is that by us in Yisrael it says, Lo tirtzach, Lo tinaf, etc. There it says, Viloi sinaf. Viloi signov, with a vav. So yes, lama veloy veloy. Why do you have the vavs over there? So Zakter Reb Tovia ben Eliezer, it's a difference between Yisro is reflecting the way the Eibishter said it. Vaschanan Dvarim, which is Mipi Moshe, is reflecting how Moshe Rabbeinu repeated it. When the Eibishter said it, when it was Namar Mipi Agvura, each one was divided separately. Loi Sirtzach was one, and Loi Sinov was another, and Loi Signov was another. So therefore, there's no ands, right? You make your statement. You take a breather, take a break. Now you're starting a new thing, right? That old rule that you learn, you can't start a sentence with your and. If it's mamish a new sentence, it shouldn't start with and. So there's no vav over there. But when Moshe said it, he said, don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this. So that needed more ands, because Moshe Rabbeinu bunched it up together. As he says, that's what's really happening over here. What's happening over here is, and when it comes to the Aseres Hadibros, we want, on the one hand, how are we going to do it? We're going to do it the way Moshe Rabbeinu said it to us. Because remember the Lashon of the Gemara, Kol Psukim, the Psukim, how do we do it? The way Moshe did it. So if Moshe Rabbeinu taught it to us, each one together, like Signov, all that together, and likewise if he taught the earlier Dibros, the one that in Taam Elyon goes on and on. If he taught it to us as separate psukim, we're doing separate psukim. That's what counts. That's what matters. Moshe Rabbeinu is what matters. But at the same time, because Moshe Rabbeinu heard it from Hashem in a specific way, we want to create a memory for that. So that's the ksiv. We created a ksiv. It's like a zikaron, a memory that you should know that this is the way it was transferred from Hashem to Moshe Rabbeinu. In fact, he uses the words, it's lahayroi shaloi amra Moshe ma'atzma. He teaches you something important. Moshe is not saying this on his own. Moshe heard it from someone. So this reminds us that Moshe Rabbeinu heard it. The Taam Elyon reminds us who Moshe heard it from, because it tells us how he heard it, by dividing them into 10 units rather than any other division. The Echshavani continues, and now he addresses the names. He says, I can tell you this is why they're called Taam Elyon and Taam Tachton. Elyon is going on God. Taam Elyon, that's the way God said it to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's called Elyon. He's Elyon ala Kol. Taam Tachton. Tachton is Moshe Rabbeinu. He's a Tachton, or Moshe is speaking to the Tachton, to the Jewish people. Therefore, he concludes this part of his Sefer saying, Bar v'nachon hu, it is so clear. Likros b'chol zman, always read b'Taam Tachton. That is the definitive one. That is how Moshe Rabbeinu taught us the psukim. That is how Moshe Rabbeinu divided the psukim. V'loi b'Taam Elyon legamri b'shum zman, and do not do it at ever using the Taam Elyon via Yashar Cheli. If I had the strength, I would be mevatel the minig of the Ashkenazim to read on Shavuos in Taam Elyon. Okay, so here you see he's calling it the minig of the Ashkenazim. We saw before Taka Reb Binyamin Selnik saying that he, and we know he's Ashkenazi, only does it on Shavuos that way, as opposed to other times. But clearly, Rabbi Zalman Hena, if he had the power, would also be mevatel what the Sfardim are doing, because it's not so clear that this is Ashkenazi Sfardi breakdown, because there are other sources that. But there were two minhagim, and the bottom line is both of them he wouldn't have liked, and he signs off Naum Hakatan Shloima Hakoyin Nikra Zalman Hena. Baal Binyan Shloima. The first work he wrote is called Binyan Shloima. His name is Shloima. So just remember, just a note about the name. If your name was Shloima, so everyone had a Yiddish version to their name as well, the secular version of their name. So Shloima was Solomon, like Solomon, and Solomon in Yiddish is Zalman. That's where the name. So that's why Shloima is Zalman. So that's what he means here when he says Shloima Akoyen Nikra Zalman. Zalman is paired with the name Shloima, similar to the concept of Solomon. Okay, this is, and as he indicates over here, he says, Lahati kuntri zel l'shalcha b'chol gvul Yisrael. So it sounds like this was like a standalone pamphlet that he tried sending around, hoping to have an influence. Ultimately, it doesn't look like he had much influence. Now let's go back to the Yavitz. The Yavitz is really, really upset with Rabbi Zalman Hena. And the Yavitz writes in Luach Eresh as follows. So most of the work is disagreeing with other things that Rabbi Zalman Hena said. Most of it had to do with the Siddur. It's not our topic for tonight. But here, he finally comes, and Ois Tov Samach Beis, the Yavitz comes to address the issue of the time. And he says, this doesn't make any sense. Why? Because why do you need a Taam Elyon if we're never using it for anything, and if it has no function, and if it doesn't do anything for us, what would be the purpose in having that? So you would say, what do you mean? Ask the same question about any kriyuk ksiv. Any kriyuk ksiv, what is the function of kriyei ha'eda? What's the function? We read it krueh. What's the function? So he says, no, that's there for drasha. There's a concept in the Gemara that yesh ein la masoires. The idea that the masoires is the masorah, the exact way of writing the words in the Torah, that is used to teach dinim, to teach halachas. Maybe some of them we have, maybe some of the dinim we don't, but that's why it's there. So there has a function. But what are you going to say over here? That what's exactly the function of having another system of Trop and another system of nikud that you're never supposed to use? Where else do we have this concept of a non-usable Trop? Isn't Trop only about, by definition, what is Trop? Trop is things to verbalize. So it's a little funny to have something to verbalize that we never verbalize, and he doesn't think it's a good comparison with a Kriya and Ksiv. Now, Rabbi Zalman Hena would say back, I already told you. This is our way of remembering that when Hashem said it to Moshe Rabbeinu, he said it in a different way. Okay, so the Yavitz doesn't like that so much. The Yavitz goes weiter and quotes a Gemara in Kedushin to demonstrate this idea that actually the division of the psukim is not the end of the world. Remember, Rabbi Zalman Hena said, you can't, there's one division, how could you redivide the psukim? So he brings a Gemara in Kedushin. The Gemara in Kedushin says, Ki asa Rav Acha bar Rav Ada Omar. When Rav Acha bar Ada came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he brought news. He said, B'Marava in the west, Paski leila haikra litlasa psuki. The following pasuk in Shmois Perek Yutes, which by us is one pasuk, it's a long pasuk. That whole pasuk. So they divided over there in three. Well, what's going on? Moshe Rabbeinu divided it one way. What gives you a right to divide it differently? So either we're a problem or they're a problem. So the Yavitz brings this Gemara and says, Ella, what are you going to say? When did Rav say we can't make our own divisions if there isn't a machlokas? But if you have a machlokas about how it's supposed to be, where one shit is like this and another shit is like that, then fine, then either one is fine. You can come and make up your own. But here, there is a machlokas, and so therefore, it's fine. And he goes on and says, this is similar to the concept of the debates between the East and the West. Midin Choy is the East and Maravoy is the West. He's using here Mesorah language. We've spoken about this in other classes, and where on the side of the Chumash, the ones that were Meduik, there used to be these notes that are about controlling the proper nature of the text, and they had their own language, and one of the words they would use is Midin Choy Maravoy, which basically means there are some differences when it comes to Nekudas, when it comes to timing, between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. And so these Masoretic notes would sometimes would indicate that, and they would use this type of language. And the Poskim discuss this all the time. So the Yavitz is saying, so this is going to be no different than a debate between the Mizrach and Ma'ariv, which happens from time to time. And so therefore, it's going to be fine. Whole same thing over here in our case with Tama Elya and Tama Tachten. Lo Yehei Ela Plukta. So it's a debate. And both of them are going to work. And so therefore, we don't have a problem of called Psukim Deloy Paskim Moshe Rabbeinu, because if you have a debate, it's kosher, it's fine. Now what's interesting is, he invokes the words East and West over here, Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. All he means to do is to bring a mashal, that this fits into a box that we already know exists. There's a long list of things where there's minor differences between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, and we live with it, so this is also perhaps like one of them. He doesn't say it is one of them. He doesn't say it is. He doesn't say Tama El and Tama Tachten is a difference between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. He says it's similar to it, and just like we can live with that, we can live with this. In recent decades, there have been those who've suggested that maybe that is in fact the origin of this dual system. That one comes from Bavel and one comes from Eretz Yisrael. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but one of the things that's said about this is that there's, at the end of each parsha, there's a siman of how many psukim are in there's a number, how many psukim are in the parsha. Basically, there's two different simanim, and there's a conflict. There's a siman at the end of the parsha, and there's a siman at the end of the sefer, and they don't add up with each other. One works well if you're doing the taam ha'elyon in Yisrael, and one works well if you're doing the taam ha'tachton in Yisrael. And remember, one of them by definition must be Babylonian. Which one must be Babylonian? The one at the end of each parsha, by definition, must be Babylonian, because in Eretz Yisrael they had a triennial cycle where they learned where they went through the Torah every 3 years. So it makes a lot of sense. And once you have that conflict, so it makes sense to say that may be the difference. And for some reason, still unexplained, the idea was for the Aseres Hadibros, let's preserve both of these. So that's that's not what the Yavitz is saying. Yavitz is just saying we have a valid two systems in Torah. He doesn't speculate about its origins and says it's just as valid as Babel and Eretz Yisrael. All I'm adding now is that some people speculate that in fact is the origins of these distinctions. Okay. Then the Yavitz goes on and says, the emes is, I don't even have to say it's a machloikas. Why? I don't have to say that it's a machloikas, because I could say each one is valid. Maybe Moshe Rabbeinu gave us both of these. One one for the tzibur, and one for the yachid. In other words, he's siding a little more with those earlier sources, Rabbi Nachem and Rabbi Yaakov, that the distinction is not Shavuos and the rest of the year, but the distinction is yachid and tzibur. He speculates maybe Moshe Rabbeinu gave both systems. Doesn't say why, but he says maybe that's what happened. And so therefore, what's the problem? And so therefore, anything that follows in terms of differences in Trop, and differences in Dagesh and Rafa, and differences in Nikudis, all is fine, it's all kosher, and we don't have any problem. What about the names? So he sees Rabbi Zalman Hena gave a name. Elyon means it's coming from God, and Tachton means it's coming from Moshe Rabbeinu. He says, that's not what it is. I'll tell you what Elyon and Tachton is. He says Elyon is the notes that you end up having to draw out your voice longer, higher notes, right? Like he's actually going to give an example. Like for example, a zarka, a pazer, a zakef gadol versus a mercha tipcha. So those are elyon. Loikein atachton. They are nigun namuch v'koil yishama. Here you don't hear the voice as much. So this is one reason he gives for elyon and tachton. Elyon and tachton means that the elyon is more of these, what we'll call the fancier trop, where a person ends up raising their voice. The thing is, it's not so simple, because when you're coming to the end and you're dividing loy tirtzach, loy tinaf, loy tzignoiv, you're not introducing any fancy trop to that system, and yet it's called part of the taam ha'elyon. So his explanation doesn't work perfectly, but okay, it works for many of it, and maybe he's going by majority. Then he goes further and says, another explanation. The taimim that are the fancy ones, b'derech klal, they're on top of the oisius. Think about it. A tlisha gedola, tlisha katana, and a pazer and revi, those stuff are on the top. Whereas the mercha and the tipcha and the munach, those stuff are on the bottom. So elyon and tachton, that's another way of explaining the difference. Then he goes into a diktuk explanation and says that there's certain trop that are called malachim, and there's certain trop that are called misharsim, without getting into the distinction of why. But it happens to be that these fancier ones are malachim. Where does a melech belong? A melech belongs on the top. So it's basically, there's three things that are coinciding together. You have trop that are called malachim, belong on the top, who are positioned on the top, and the person needs to raise their voice louder. And so therefore, these are reasons why we're going to call it taam ha'elyon versus the taam ha'tachton. This is the explanation that he gives. Presumably, it would work well with the sources we saw earlier, in terms of, we saw Rabbi Yaakov Emden calling it gvoyim and shvelim. So gvoyim and shvelim also works. Gvoyim and shvelim in terms of on top of the word, under the word. Gvoyim and shvelim in terms of how the person is saying this. There are other explanations about elyon and tachton. However, because we're focused on our story, which is mostly the debate between Rabbi Zalman Hena and the Yavitz and the sources they brought, so we're going to stick with this, and we're not going to go further into this issue. And now that we saw this, we understand why the Yavitz was so upset. This was one issue. How can you come and basically advocate a change where there were two different minhagim of how it was being done, but there were minhagim, and they're going on for centuries, and to just come and suggest that you want to change it based on your theory, that the Yavitz made it very upset, which is why he put out his book Luach Eresh against Rabbi Zalman Hena, and again, in terms of dealing with the problematic haskamas, he claimed that they were forgeries. So this is a small window into this time, this period in time, where we're basically between the 1400s and the 1700s, and I think what we see over here is in this area we see a lot of confusion about this issue. We see Rabbanim coming and sorting it out. We're seeing different theories about the names and different minhagim about how this is supposed to happen. And now I want to turn to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, because we're going to see something amazing in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Usually, in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, he's going to typically follow what the Magen Avraham does. And the Magen Avraham over here just says there's two systems of reading. Some people do it this way, some people do it that way. Only the what, no why. What's interesting is that the Alter Rebbe broke out of that mold and spent a lot of time actually explaining not only the what, but it seems also the why. So let's have a look, and as we're reading this passage from the Alter Rebbe, let's see who this sounds like. Which of the earlier sources that we saw, let's see who does this sound like. Says Alter Rebbe as follows: the taam beis neginesu, the reason we have the two systems of Trop, Shaarei Tefilah, the first one is organized according to the way it is written, ksiv. Shenichtav kol dibur v'dibur befarsha b'fnei atzma, where every dibur is in its own place. Shemei anoichi ad lo sisa, from anoichi to lo sisa is parshas achastuma. It's one parsha. It's one dibur. It's true that anoichi, I've been glossing over this the entire time. In the Taam Elyon, as much as we are doing it by dibros, there's one exception to that, and that's the first two. Anoichi and lo yelecha are actually, we use a Taam Elyon to turn it into one. And that's what the Alter Rebbe is referring to over here, and later we'll come back to the reason why that happened. In this model that he's calling the Kasuv, Nichtav B'Dalit Parsha Stumos, so here it's written with four Stumos. Ve'hen Dalit Diburim, there are four separate utterances, Lekach Nasma and Dalit Psukim, which is why we turn it into four Psukim. So all of this is what? This is the system that we read on Shavuos. And what does he call it? He calls it Ksiv. Then he goes further and says, V'asheni u'mesudar lefi akri. The other one is organized according to the Kri. Shal'inyan akriya, when you're reading it, all those little lois are one. Now what does it mean? What does this mean practically? So the Alter Rebbe goes on so let's already stop here. He's clearly using Rabbi Zalman Hena's language. He adopted Zalman Hena's model. Kri versus Ksiv. As much as Rabbi Zalman Hena is like very out of the box and it made the Yavitz nervous, the Alter Rebbe seems to be bringing his models, the difference between Kri and Ksiv. But now what the Alter Rebbe does is he adds beer into what does this mean? And he says, the Hainu, I'll tell you what the nafkamin is. According to halacha, if I'm sitting and I'm doing chitas, and I'm reading Lo Sirtzach, Lo Sinov, Lo Signov, Lo Sanav Recha Chakar, I'm not allowed to stop. I'm not allowed to stop in the middle. Because that's the Kri. The Kri is as one pasuk. Afilu k'shekayre b'yachid, even if you're learning on your own. Shekalav sakas hapsukim and halacha l'Moshe Messinai. All these things are halacha l'Moshe Messinai. V'asar l'hafsik b'makom shalei pasak lanu Moshe Messinai. You're not allowed to stop where Moshe didn't stop. So Kri is Moshe, is linked with Moshe Rabbeinu, is what Moshe Rabbeinu gave us. The Kri. And when you're reading a pasuk, you can't stop in the middle and deal with some logistical issue. You need to pay a bill, no problem, finish a pasuk. That doesn't work with loisir. You have to finish. Now call and pay off your bill. And because that's a real halacha in terms of when you're learning Chumash on your own or doing Shnai Mikavacha Targum, so gan kishekoidim b'pam echad, so too, when we read it, so even if you're reading it, and you're not reading it in a way where you're going to take breaks, you're reading it in shul, like a mensch. No one takes breaks in between to pay a bill in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah. So gan kishakoyim b'pam echad, where you aren't going to be making a hefsek, still, we use a tune that ties it all together. That ties all these that ties all of them together. So too earlier, when it comes to the Kri, we divide it into multiple psukim. What does this mean? Number one, it means that as a Yachid, you're allowed to, all of a sudden, you're allowed to take breaks over there. You read, you could stop, you can make a phone call. There's no problem in doing so. And because that's the case, so when it comes to reading it b'tzibur, we're also going to divide it as separate psukim. And this is the right way. And this is Moshe. He's using Rabbi Zalman Hena's model. The Kri follows what we got from Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the real division. This is an afkamina lahalacha in terms of dvarim b'teilim in the middle of learning. And that's how we're supposed to read it. Then he adds another line. There's actually evidence for this because we know how many psukim there's supposed to be in the book, in Sefer Shmos. And if the count, I was getting confused before, if you go to the end of Sefer Shmos, he doesn't specify, but this is what it means. When you go to the end of Sefer Shmos and you look at the numbers, it only works out if you go with what Rabbi Zalman Hena called the Kri, what we call the taam hatachtoin, dividing it the normal way, the way the standard chumashim are printed, the number only works. So that's real. And that's why we have that number over there at the end of the Sefer. Good. Till now, you have Rabbi Zalman Hena. And here is where you're going to see the difference between Rabbi Zalman Hena as a person and as a posek, and the Alter Rebbe as a person and as a posek. Because what did Rabbi Zalman Hena do? So far, they're exactly the same. In fact, now they're the same. The Alter Rebbe did a service by bolstering Rabbi Zalman Hena's argument. Firstly, he put it into halachic language of where you're supposed to make a hefsek and not supposed to make a hefsek. And secondly, he added the factor of the number of the psukim from the Messiah at the end of the Sefer, which Rabbi Zalman Hena didn't have. So he's bolstering it. But all of a sudden, look at the continuation. And despite everything that I just said right now, no, on Shavuos we read in the first system, what we call the system, the taam ha'elyon, where each one of the Aseres Hadibros becomes a standalone thing. He says this is done on Shavuos. That's the minig that we saw reflected in Rabbi Yamin Selnick's tshuva. Then he goes further and says, why? Why do we do that? Lefi shaboy b'yoim nasnu or nitnu Aseres Hadibros, because this is the day when the Aseres Hadibros was given. Therefore, we read it the way it was given. Fine. So it sounds like the Alter Rebbe is saying over here that we want to somehow relive the moment of Matan Torah. Reliving the moment of Matan Torah means you want to experience 10 commandments. 10 commandments, each one's distinct. So we make it distinct by doing what? Think about it. By moving away from the right way. That's essentially the Alter Rebbe's language. And this is not Yavitz. What did Yavitz tell us? What do you mean right way? There's two ways. It's a machlokes. Maybe lechatchila, Moshe Rabbeinu gave it to us in two ways. It's all good, right? No, you don't have that from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe is taking Rabbi Zalman Hena. There's one way. The one way is what we call the taam hatachton. Oh, but we have a minig where we override that. Why? What justifies that? What justifies that? So you have an objective. We understand you have an objective. You want to somehow stress 10. Okay, I get it. You have an objective. Does the end justify the means? Does the end justify the means to go against the Messiah? To go against Allah? He used the words Allah Moshe Sinai. So a lot of people have struggled with this because Alter Rebbe doesn't so much deal with that part. There's been numerous, I've seen at least 3 different explanations, so I'm not going to give you any because if you have 3 explanations, you know what that means. It's a little bit of a problem. The Alter Rebbe doesn't explain what justifies it. Then the Alter Rebbe goes, V'yeshnai again, the other meaning that we saw from Reb Yaakov Habib and from Menachem de Lenzano, that all year, whenever you're reading B'tzibur, you read it B'tam Elyon, and again, Alter Rebbe has no problem. This is the difference between the Alter Rebbe and Rabbi Zalman Hena. They both essentially agreed in principle, but they came to very different conclusions b'negei l'poil. For Rabbi Zalman Hena, I think you see this sometimes. Sometimes, like, people agree about a theory, but then one person says, so if that's the case, so now that means we have to fire this person or whatever area in life, right? And the other person says, I agree with everything you just said, But no, we actually don't have to fire that person, right? So Rabbi Zalman Hena was that type of person, not only here. He did it for other things as well. So because he came with things, so therefore, well, we have to change all the Sidurim or whatever it is. Okay, and Alter Rebbe is not. Alter Rebbe is very satisfied, it seems, leaving the minig the way it is, and the minig Chabad is essentially the second minig that he says at the end. Okay, I want to do one more thing, and with this we're going to close out and conclude.
I'm not about Qaeda, but they do it only on Shavuos?
No, Chabad. Yeah, Chabad does every time. Every time. Yeah, the second version of the Alter Rebbe is what we do all the time. Okay. There's a passage from the Chizkuni. The Chizkuni planted a seed. It actually comes back to something that I said in a prior shir, and I threw it out as speculation, and I want to now come back to it as something that may be helpful in the conversation here. Because ultimately, we are still left with a question, and many of these sources didn't address the question. Why? Why do we have two systems, or why are we using this Tama Elyoin system, especially after reading from the Alter Rebbe that the Tama Tachtoin is the primary one? So again, we have a little oisius over here because we want to have the Aseres Hadibros, but maybe there's something more that could be said based on this passage in the Chizkuni. So the Chizkuni, he lived in the 1200s, 1300s, France. He's one of the Rishonim. It's a Pirush on Chumash. And he's considerably earlier than any of the sources we spoke about till now. And he also talks about the two Neginois. We're not surprised. Remember, we see in the manuscripts dating back to the 1000s the fact that there are two Neginois. But let's see the words that Rabbi Chizkiah says. Yesh beroiv hadibros shtei neginois. Most of the dibros, again, some of them are the same. Kabbalah Zavicha V'Semecha doesn't change. But most of them have two different models. Lelamed, telling you, Shabbat Seres, on Shavuos, Shehi Dugma Matan Torah, which is a dugma for Matan Torah, U'mitargemin on hadibros, and we translate the dibros. Koirin kol dibros lo yilacha v'chol dibros zachar b'neginas hagdolos. So we do the whole lo yilacha instead of dividing it in 4 psukim or whatever it is. We turn it into one long thing. And likewise, zachar yom Shabbos l'kachay, instead of having it 1, 2, 3, 4 psukim, we turn it all into one thing. Lases kol achas man pasuk echad. Shakol echad man dibra achas asva, because each one is a dibra. On the other hand, when it comes to leisirsach, leisinaf, leisigna, leisana, here, these koinim b'neginas haktanos, we use the smaller trop, right? This is actually interesting. It comes back to what I spoke about before, that at no point are you doing Tama Elyon or Tama Tachtoin. You're actually using both. For loisinaf, on Shavuos, what you're doing is you're using Tama Tachtoin, you're using smaller trop. And he says that, koinim b'neginas haktanos, lases dalet psukim, shehein dalet dibros. Aval b'chodesh Shvat, kishakoyin Yisroi, then you don't do that system. Then you do the other system. So Rabbi Chizkiah ben Manoach says essentially Shavuos, you do what we call Tama Elyon, and the rest of the year you do Tam HaTachta. I want to call your attention to the beginning. Why? The Chiddush is Aseres. In other words, the default is, what's the right way to do it? The right way to do it is you do it all year. But Aseres, on Shavuos, we do something unusual. Why? So he says the following 5-6 words. She dugma matan Torah u'mitargamin an adibros. If you tell me dugma matan Torah, I had that a little in the Alter Rebbe. In fact, the Alter Rebbe saw the Chizkuni. Maybe the Alter Rebbe is taking it from there. Dugma matan Torah. What does dugma matan Torah mean? I want to relive the fact that there were 10, so therefore we're breaking the rules and we're doing it that way. Good. Why do you add the words u'mitargamin an adibros? Why do you add the words u'mitargamin an adibros? What's an negea? So you say, because the rule is, when it comes to the Targum, you're only allowed to do pasuk by pasuk. You're not allowed to do a Targum, you're not allowed to read 2 psukim b'tzibur. When you're doing, okay, first let's pause. It is clear from this passage in the Reb Chizkiah ben Manoach, the Chizkuni, that Jews in his time, in Europe, were doing the Targum, Metargamina Nadibris in Shul, they were doing the Targum, the ancient way, the way it was done in Bavel, where you had a Baal Koyer reading the Pasuk, and then a Maturgaman get up and saying the Targum. It is clear from here that this was done. The truth is, we know it from other places. We spoke about it in the previous year. We knew that they did the Targum that we call today Targum Yonis and Ben Azil, is what they read, not all year. Specifically on certain Yom Tovim, I can't tell you for sure, but definitely Shavuos, they read it. Mitargamin and Hadibros. Okay, so now that they're doing that, so you're not allowed to do more than one. So this explains why you need a taam ha'elyon. Why do you need a taam ha'elyon? Just do let the Baal Kodesh stop and let the guy from the Targum translate that. Do stop him mitachas and let the guy translate it. And later, do as one pasuk and let the Meturgaman translate it. How is the Mitargamin on Hadibros, how is that relevant over here to this factor? So what happened was, a number of years ago, we did a shir on a machzer, a medieval machzer that was called the Tiny Machzer. It's this little manuscript at the JTS in Manhattan, and it has art. So we were going, most of the time, we were looking at the images of the art. But one of the things we also noticed over there is that after each dibra, there is the Targum, where the guy, the Meturgaman, is going to say in Aramaic what the pasuk is. But before the Targum, there's a piyut. Each one has a piyut, a long piyut in Aramaic. Akdamos is that same thing, just for the beginning of Kriya. So, B'chodesh, they read, as we spoke then, you read the first pasuk, the Meturgaman is going to get up now to do the Targum, and before that, he does, before I do the Targum, let me tell you, I have Akdama I want to make. So that's Akdamos, which explains the origins of the minig, to do it after, what did we say then? To do it after the first pasuk. After the first pasuk, which everyone later said, there's a hefsek, because they stopped doing the Targum, so it looked like a hefsek. We spoke about that then. So once you understand, so when they were doing the Aseres Hadibros, each Targum needed to be preceded by a piyut. So if it needs to be preceded by a piyut, then the only way to do it is to do it this way. Because if you just do it, and you stop there, then the guy goes into a long piyut and then translates it, but then you're in the same, then you don't have a piyut for the next pasuk. That doesn't sound nice. Whereas if you do it in the taam ha'elyon, so all of a sudden now it's nice and clean. Before the Targum guy gets up, you have the piyut. He has to get the whole thing in one pasuk because it needs to be pasuk by pasuk. So therefore, we do it in this way in the taam ha'elyon. That would explain, to come back to the Yaivitz's language. I know this is not the Alter Rebbe, but that would explain, to use Yaivitz's language, why there was once upon a time two legitimate ones. Okay, there were two legitimate ones. Why did both survive? Here there was an impulse to allow both of them to survive because they wanted to have this other system, even though normally they weren't accepting the taam ha'elyon. Normally they're having a taam ha'tachton, or to use Alter Rebbe's language, because the taam ha'tachton is superior, that's the right one, it's the better one. To use the Yaivitz's language, they're both fine, but still they would have taken the taam ha'tachton for whatever reason. Or probably because of the fact that it maybe had to do with Ben Asher, with a big influence. But because of the desire to do the piyut that had this Aramaic, so that would explain. Okay, so it's possible. And so I said that then in the shir as speculation. I said maybe because these piyutim was taam ha'elyon. So there's someone, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who this was. He sent me a WhatsApp a few weeks later. He said, look at this chizkuni. It's mashma like that from this chizkuni. And I think he's right. So anyway, this is a small taste of what's a much larger sugya. Many more people weighed in on this issue. I think it is fair to say today there's much more clarity on this than our ancestors had. Definitely when it was printed, scaled on top of each other, made things very different. I also find it interesting in terms of the many different names. One of the names is Elyon, Tachton, Taam ha'elyon, and a Tachton. And what does Chassidus say about Matan Torah? It's all about the chibur of the Elyonim and the Tachtonim. And in those chumashim over here, they were very mahader and having a chibur and the Elyon and the Tachton, having the Trop. Whereas by us, it's not so much of a chibur, because by us we have the Elyon here, and we have the Tachton in the Chumash, and we have the Elyon weiter. But the main thing is we should all do our job of making a chibur, Elyon, and Tachton, and Kabbalah Satayra b'simcha v'pnimius.